The man didn't even look at her when he said it. Harold Greer leaned back in his chair behind the counter of the Millhaven General Store, thumbs hooked into his suspenders, and let his eyes travel from Clara Whitmore's worn boots up to the dark circles. Beneath her eyes, the kind of look a man gives a horse he's already decided isn't worth buying. Eli stood beside her, 4 years old, gripping the hem of her coat with both fists, his lips chapped raw from 3 days of cold wind. "I already told you once," Harold said, and his voice carried that particular flavor of satisfaction that some men reserve for moments when they hold every card. "Your husband's debts don't disappear because he did. You want credit at this store. You pay what Owen owed first. Every penny." Clara's jaw tightened. "Owen's been gone 8 months. I've got a child. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for flour and salt." Harold's mouth curved at the corner. Not a smile. "Something colder than that. Then go ask someone who owes you something, Mrs. Whitmore. Because I don't." He turned back to his ledger. Done with her. She was furniture. Behind Clara, 2 men who'd been pretending to examine a shelf of tobacco tins shared a glance. Nobody moved to help. Nobody said a word. The only sound was the wind pressing against the store's thin walls and Eli shifting his weight from one foot to the other, still holding on to her coat like if he let go she'd drift away. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you've ever needed one small act of kindness and watched it get denied, then you already know exactly what Clara felt in that moment. This story is about what happens to a woman who has nothing left, and what one unexpected choice can do to change everything. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Clara Whitmore, standing in that store, deciding what kind of woman she's going to be. She didn't cry. That was the first thing. Clara had used up her crying months ago. Somewhere between the morning, she found Owen's side of the bed empty, and the afternoon, a man from the bank rode out to explain, in very patient, very final terms, what the word foreclosure meant for the small piece of land she'd believed was hers. She'd cried then. She'd cried until there was nothing left but a hollow, practical kind of quiet that settled in behind her ribs and stayed. She took Eli's hand, walked out of Greer's store, and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the gray November air while she counted what she had. $3.40. Half a loaf of bread in the suitcase. 1 blanket. Eli's coat was too small. She'd noticed that morning when she'd buttoned it up and seen his wrists sticking out pale and thin below the cuffs. Millhaven was the 4th town she'd tried in 2 weeks. The others hadn't been kinder. A widow with a child and no land and no family in the territory was not a figure that inspired generosity. She inspired the particular discomfort. People feel around problems they don't want to become responsible for. Doors had been polite but firm. Eyes had slid sideways. The message was always the same. Even when the words were different, "Not our problem. Move along." "Mama," Eli said, looking up at her. His nose was running. She didn't have a handkerchief clean enough to do much good, so she crouched down and wiped it with her sleeve anyway. "Are we going to find a house today?" "We're going to find somewhere warm," she said. "That's the plan." He nodded. Serious the way young children get when they're trying to match the mood of the adult they depend on. He didn't ask what happened if they didn't. She was grateful for that and hated herself a little for being grateful. The livery stable at the edge of town was run by an old man named Fenwick, who had the slow, careful disposition of someone who'd decided a long time ago not to get involved in other people's difficulties. He let her water the mule she'd borrowed being a generous word for a transaction. Owen had apparently arranged and never bothered to explain and didn't comment on the state of her suitcase or the boy sitting on it that passed for kindness in Millhaven. "Maddox Ranch," she said, because she'd heard the name twice now, and on the frontier you followed the names that came up more than once. "How far?" Fenwick looked at her the way he might look at a person who'd asked for directions to the edge of a cliff. 12 miles north. up through the pass. What's past the pass? More cold. He went back to his work. Man doesn't take on help, especially not. He stopped himself, which she supposed was meant to be polite, especially not women with children. She heard the rest of it without needing him to say it. Thank you, she said, and meant it, because he'd given her water and not laughed at her, and that had to be enough. The trail north was not a road. It was the suggestion of a road 2 ruts worn into the earth by wagon wheels that had passed this way often enough to leave a memory in the ground. The wind came down from the mountains in long, sweeping gusts that got underneath her coat and sat against her skin like something deliberate, something personal. Eli rode on the mule because he was 4, and his legs were short, and she would not let him walk in this cold, even if it meant she had to. She walked beside the animal, one hand on the rope, her boots finding the frozen ground one step at a time. She thought about Owen. She didn't want to. There was nothing useful in thinking about Owen anymore, but the cold had a way of stripping away the things a person used to keep unwanted thoughts at bay. He hadn't been cruel, exactly. That was the complicated part. He'd been careless. Careless with money, careless with the land, careless in the particular way of men who assume that consequences will work themselves out eventually, that someone or something will catch them before they fall. He'd been wrong. And when he understood how wrong, he'd chosen the one exit that left her and Eli standing in the rubble. She'd spent months being angry about that. Now it was just a fact she carried, like the weight of the suitcase. Pass narrowed and the wind got meaner, and she watched the sky the way a person watches something they can't afford to underestimate. Clouds in the west had that particular heavy look, not gray, but a kind of bruised yellow-white that she'd learned to read as snow on the way. Maybe 3 hours, maybe less. She had to get somewhere before it came down. The ranch appeared, the way things appear in mountain country, without announcement, simply there when it hadn't been a moment before. She came around a bend in the trail, and the valley opened below her, and there it was, a main house, 2 long outbuildings, a barn that had seen better days, but was still standing, and a fence line that ran as far as she could see in both directions. Smoke coming from the chimney. It looked like the most beautiful thing she'd seen in months. It also looked like a place built by someone who valued being left alone. The gate at the end of the approach was solid, heavy timber, and it was closed. She stood there for a moment, holding the mule's rope, Eli asleep against its neck, and she thought about what she was doing. Riding up to a stranger's gate with a sleeping child and $3.40 and asking what? Asking to be let in. Asking for something she had no claim on from a man who didn't know her and owed her nothing. She thought about the look on Harold Greer's face when he'd turned back to his ledger. She opened the gate and went through. He was at the fence line on the near side of the yard, working on a section of post that had come loose, and he didn't hear her at first. She had time to look at him before he turned, a tall man, broad through the shoulders, maybe 40 or a few years past it, with the kind of face that had stopped being young a while ago and had arrived at something harder and more settled. He moved with the economy of someone who'd learned to make every action count because there was always more work waiting. When he turned and saw her, he didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her and then at the boy, asleep on the mule, taking a quiet measure of the situation. "I'm looking for work," Clara said. She'd decided on the walk down the slope that she wasn't going to lead with need. Men on the frontier responded better to utility than to desperation, and she needed him to hear something in her voice other than please. "Can cook, mend, keep accounts. I know cattle work. I worked my husband's ranch for 4 years before." She stopped. "I'm a hard worker. I won't be a burden." Cole Maddox looked at her for a long moment. His expression was not unkind. It was simply careful, in the way of someone who'd made decisions he'd regretted before. "Where's your husband?" "Gone." He looked at the boy again. Eli had woken up and was watching the rancher with the solemn attention of a child who has learned that adults in conversation sometimes decide important things. His nose was still running. His wrists still stuck out from his too small coat. "You've got nowhere to go," Maddox said. It wasn't a question. Clara thought about lying. She was good at maintaining a certain dignity under pressure, and the honest answer felt like surrender. But she was also cold down to things she couldn't feel anymore, and the snow was coming. And she looked at this man's face and decided that whatever he wasn't the kind who'd appreciate being managed. Not tonight, she said. No, something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't read it, couldn't tell if it was calculation or reluctance, or something older and less nameable. He looked at the sky the same way she had, reading the same clouds. Storm's coming, he said. I know. He put down his fence tool, picked up his jacket from the post where he'd hung it, and pulled it on. He looked at her one more time, and she held his gaze, because she was not going to look away, and she was not going to apologize for being here, and she was not going to let him see how close to the edge of herself she actually was. Barn's warm, he said finally. You and the boy can stay there tonight while I figure out what to make of this. It wasn't a welcome. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was more like a grudging acknowledgement that some problems don't go away if you ignore them, and a man with any decency has to decide what to do about that. She said, thank you, and meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. The barn was warm. He hadn't been wrong about that. There was fresh hay, and a small iron stove in the corner that he lit without comment, and a lantern he left hanging on a nail, and then he went out and closed the door behind him without another word. Eli, fully awake now, stood in the middle of the barn and looked around with the evaluating gaze of a 4-year-old who reserves judgment. It smells like horses, he announced. That's because it's a barn. Is this where we're going to live? For tonight. She crouched down and looked at him directly. The way she'd found was the only way to have an honest conversation with him. He had Owen's eyes, the same light shade that looked almost gray in certain light, but the set of his face was hers, the way he held his chin up even when he was uncertain. I need you to be very good tonight, Eli. No noise, no fussing. Can you do that? I'm always good, he said, with the calm confidence of a child who believes this completely. She almost laughed. It came out somewhere between a laugh and the other thing, and she pressed it down before it became the other thing, and got to work, making them as comfortable as the barn allowed. She heard him come back around 9 o'clock. Not into the barn, he stopped outside, and she heard him moving around the yard, the sound of boots on frozen ground, checking on something. Checking, she realized, on whether the storm had arrived yet and how bad it was going to be. She lay in the hay next to Eli, who was asleep with the absolute totality of young children, and she listened to the wind picking up outside and thought about tomorrow. What she would say to Cole Maddox in the daylight, when the storm had passed and he'd had time to think about what he'd agreed to. What she would do if he told her she needed to move on, or she would go. She didn't let herself think past that. There was no useful information in that direction. What she did let herself think about was the way he'd looked at the clouds and at Eli's 2 small coat sleeves, and the way he'd made his decision without fanfare or lengthy deliberation. The way a man makes a decision he knows is going to cost him something, but decides the cost is acceptable. She'd known men in her life who would have calculated longer and concluded differently. She didn't know what kind of man Cole Maddox was, but she knew that he had lit the stove, and that mattered more than she wanted to admit. The snow started around midnight. She could hear it against the barn roof, quiet and relentless, the sound of the territory doing what it did without caring, one way or the other, who it was doing it to. She pulled the blanket tighter around Eli's shoulders and closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she slept in a building with a roof and a working stove, and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. It wasn't safety, not yet. But it was the beginning of something, and Clara Whitmore, who had survived everything the last 8 months had thrown at her, understood how to make the most of a beginning. Whatever Cole Maddox decided in the morning, she would be ready for it. She had come too far to be anything else. Cole Maddox was already up when the storm broke. Clara heard him before she saw him boots on the frozen yard, the low sound of a man talking to animals, the way people talk when they think no one's listening, short and practical and almost gentle. She lay still for a moment in the hay, oriented herself to where she was and why, and then got up without waking Eli and cracked the barn door open an inch. The snow had left maybe 4 inches on the ground, not the disaster she'd feared, but enough to make everything look remade. Cole was at the water trough, breaking the ice that had formed overnight with a long-handled axe. His breath came out in visible clouds. He worked without hurrying, methodical, the axe rising and falling with a rhythm that suggested he'd done this particular task so many times it no longer required thought. She watched him for a moment and tried to take his measure. There was no anger in the way he moved, no resentment which she'd been half-braced for the resentment of a man who'd made an impulsive decision in the cold dark and was now regretting it in the sober gray morning. He just looked like a man breaking ice in a trough because the animals needed water, and that was what needed doing. She pushed the door open and walked out. He heard her and looked up, and for a beat neither of them said anything. Then he nodded at the house. Coffee's on the stove, pots on the left. That was all. He went back to the trough. She stood there another second, surprised by the absence of a speech, no conditions laid out, no reconsideration delivered with an apologetic face. Then she went inside. The house was spare in the way of men who live alone and have stopped noticing what's missing. The main room had a table with 2 chairs, a cook stove, a shelf of supplies, a rifle on the wall, and a window that looked out toward the eastern slope. There was no decoration, no photographs, nothing on the walls except a calendar 2 years out of date that he'd probably left up because it was covering a crack in the plaster. She found the coffee and poured a cup and stood at the window drinking it while the heat worked back into her fingers. Then she looked at the shelf of supplies and looked at the stove and began pulling things down. Because sitting still had never been something she was built for, and she had a very clear understanding that her presence here needed to justify itself quickly. By the time Cole came in from the yard, she had cornmeal porridge on the stove, bacon from the side he had hanging in the cold room, and Eli sitting at the table wrapped in his blanket, eating a piece of hard bread she'd softened in a little warm water. Cole stopped in the doorway and took this in. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She kept her back to him, stirring the porridge. "Sit down. It'll be ready in a few minutes," he sat. She heard the chair scrape against the floor, heard him put his hat on the table, heard the particular quality of silence that meant a man deciding whether to say something. She'd gotten good at reading that silence in the years with Owen, though Owen's silences had generally been leading somewhere she didn't want to follow. "I've been thinking," Cole said. "I assumed. I could use help with the accounts. Books are a mess." He paused. "The woman who used to do them moved to Cheyenne 2 years ago. I've been managing, but I'm not good with figures the way she was." Clara turned and looked at him. "Is that what you've decided to offer?" "Still working it out," he said, which was at least honest. "I'd need to know more about what you can actually do before I put anything formal on the table." "Then ask," he asked. And over the next hour, over porridge and bad coffee that she improved slightly by adding the last of the chicory she'd carried in her suitcase, they had the most practical conversation she'd had with another adult in months. He asked about the ranch she'd worked with Owen the size, the type of cattle, the rotation they'd used for the grazing land. He asked about her accounting, whether she'd had formal instruction or learned by doing. He asked about Eli without asking about Eli directly, circling around the subject the way men sometimes do when they want information but don't want to seem like they're prying. "He's healthy," she said, preempting the real question. "He's not going to be a problem. I wasn't thinking he would be. Most people have been." Cole looked at Eli, who was now methodically building a structure out of breadcrumbs on the table with the absolute concentration of a child engaged in serious architectural work. "He's 4? 4.5. He'll tell you it matters." "The half?" "Significantly." Something shifted in Cole's expression, not quite a smile, but the place where a smile might have been if he'd been someone who smiled more readily. He looked back at his coffee. "I've got 1,200 head going into winter. Lost 40 to the early cold before I got them all moved. Fence line on the north side needs work before the next storm. There's a section that won't hold. I've got one hired hand who's reliable and one who isn't, and the one who isn't will probably be gone before Christmas. Clara listened. Pay would be room and board, plus a small wage. The house has a back room I've been using for storage. It's not large. We don't need large. He nodded. Then we'll try it. Those were the exact words he used. We'll try it. Not you can stay, or I'll take you on something more tentative than that, more honest about the fact that neither of them knew how this was going to go. She appreciated that, even though it was unsettling, because the truth was, she didn't know either, and a man who pretended otherwise would have been harder to trust. The hired hand who was reliable was named Jasper, older than Cole by maybe 10 years, with a gray beard. He kept trimmed short and a manner of speaking that involved long pauses between sentences while he assembled what he wanted to say. He looked at Clara with open curiosity. The first morning she came out to help with the morning feeding, then looked at Cole, then looked back at Clara. "You're the woman from the barn," he said. "I'm the woman who's helping with the books and whatever else needs doing," she said. Jasper considered this. "You know cattle?" "Enough." He handed her a pitchfork. She took it without comment and went to work. By the end of the morning, Jasper had relocated from curiosity to something resembling provisional respect, which was about as much as she could ask for, from a man she'd known for 3 hours. The other hired hand was named Dolan. He was maybe 25, good-looking in the specific way that had probably gotten him out of trouble more often than it should have. And he had the quality Clara associated with men who charm their way through situations they should be working their way through. He watched her with something that wasn't quite hostility and wasn't quite friendliness, more like speculation, the kind that waits to see which way a thing is going to fall before committing to an opinion. He didn't help. He didn't hinder. He just watched. And Clara had enough experience to know that the watching was its own kind of message. The books were, as Cole had said, a mess. Not because he was unintelligent. She could see from the entries that he understood what he was tracking, but because he'd been doing the work of 4 people. And the accounting had kept getting pushed to the end of the day when he was too tired to. Be careful. And errors had compounded over 2 years into a situation that required patience and a willingness to start from the beginning. She sat at the table with the ledgers after dinner, Eli asleep in the back room and worked by lamplight, while Cole sat on the other side of the table cleaning a bridle and not bothering her. There was something she hadn't expected in that the simple presence of another adult in the room who wasn't demanding anything from her. She'd forgotten how much she'd missed that. Even with Owen, even in the good years, there had always been something slightly vigilant about her evenings. Some attention reserved for what he might need or what might be coming. Cole didn't seem to need anything. He cleaned the bridle. He got up twice to add wood to the stove. Once he refilled her coffee, without being asked, set it down beside the ledger, and went back to his chair. She found the first major accounting error, around 9 o'clock, a mismatch between what he'd paid for winter feed and what was recorded, off by enough that it had been throwing his calculations for almost a year. She cross-referenced 3 entries before she was certain. "You overpaid Kellerman's feed store last January," she said, "by $62. Cole looked up from the bridle. "Sure? The receipt is here." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. "The number he wrote in doesn't match the receipt he gave you." He rounded up. Cole looked at the entry for a long time. "That's not a mistake," he said finally. "That's Kellerman. Do you want me to keep looking?" "Yes," he looked at her. "I want you to go through all of it." She went through all of it. By the time she stopped for the night, she'd found 4 separate instances of what she was increasingly confident were not errors. Cole sat across from her and listened while she walked him through each one, and his expression during this recitation was the controlled, deliberate stillness of a man who is angry and is not letting the anger out because he hasn't yet decided what to do with it. "Kellerman's on the county board," he said when she finished. "That's not accounting," she said. "That's a different problem. 2 tend to travel together." He was quiet for a moment. "How much total?" She'd already added it up. $214. Over 3 years. He was quiet for longer than usual. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the wind had come back, less violent than the night before but steady, the kind of wind that doesn't stop. You found all of this in one evening, he said. The books aren't complicated. They're just wrong. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Most people I've had look at those books told me they were fine. Kellerman recommend those people? A pause. Then two of them, yes. She didn't say anything else about it. She closed the ledger and stood up and said goodnight and went to the back room. But she heard him sit there a while longer before he moved, heard the particular quality of a man's stillness when he's rearranging his understanding of something he thought he'd already figured out. The neighboring ranchers came on the fourth day. There were three of them, Burkett, whose land ran along Cole's eastern fence, a man named Pruitt, who controlled the water access on the south side of the valley, and a third man she didn't recognize, younger, who seemed to be there mainly as company for the other two. They rode into the yard mid-morning, and Cole went out to meet them, while Clara stayed at the fence line, where she'd been helping Jasper repair a section of post. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read it in the way the men stood. Burkett did most of the talking. He was a thick man, well-fed, with the settled confidence of someone accustomed to being the authority in a room. He kept gesturing, and Cole kept listening, and the listening had the quality of a man who is not going to say what he actually thinks until he's ready. After about 20 minutes, the three men rode back out without coming near the fence line. Cole walked over to where she and Jasper were working. That looked friendly, Jasper said. Burkett's heard I've taken on a woman and a child, Cole said. He picked up a post anchor and began setting it without further preamble. And Clara said, and he thinks it's a mistake. His words ought to be thinking about who he lets onto his property in hard times, because charity has a way of attracting more charity, and he doesn't want to see this end of the valley turn into somewhere people come to ask for things. Clara drove a nail with more force than strictly necessary. What did you say? I said I'd take it under advisement. Stopped and looked at him. That's all? I didn't say I'd act on it. He set the post anchor in the frozen ground and leaned on it to test the depth. Ket says a lot of things. I've been listening to Burkett say things for 12 years. It doesn't always require a response. Jasper made a small sound that might have been agreement. Clara went back to her work, but the morning had changed its flavor. Burkett's name sat in her mind with a familiar weight, not Burkett specifically, but the type of man, the kind who had calculated that her existence was an inconvenience and had done something about it. She'd met him in other forms in every town she'd passed through, and the thing about men like that was they rarely stopped at one conversation. She didn't say this to Cole. He was already aware of it. She could see that in the set of his jaw and the way he'd watched the three riders go. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. What Burkett had put in motion, however, moved faster than she'd expected. By the end of the week, the small community around Millhaven had formed an opinion. She knew this because she went with Cole into town for supplies, the first time she'd been back, since Harold Greer had told her she had nothing worth giving credit to, and she felt it in the way certain eyes moved when they walked past. Not everyone. Some people looked at her with neutral or even sympathetic curiosity, but there was a section of Millhaven's population that had apparently decided Clara Whitmore's presence at Cole Maddox's ranch was either a scandal, a mistake, or a threat to something they valued, and they communicated this with the small, sharp tools that communities use when they want to exclude without being seen to do it directly. The woman at the dry goods store was slow to help her. Two men outside the feed store had a conversation that stopped when she walked past and resumed when she was a few feet away. Post office, the clerk asked Cole, not her. Cole, whether he'd be needing any mail forwarded for his new arrangement, with the emphasis on those last two words doing a great deal of work. Cole the clerk he'd be needing whatever mail arrived for his property, the same as always. Walking back to the wagon, Clara said, I'm sorry. What? For making your life more complicated. Cole loaded a sack of flour into the wagon bed without looking at her. You didn't make anything complicated. Burkett went around talking because Burkett goes around talking. That's on him, not you. It affects you. Most things that happen in a valley this size affect everybody one way or another. He stopped and looked at her directly. If I was going to change my mind because of what Burkett says to the clerk at the post office, I would have changed it 4 days ago when Burkett was standing in my yard telling me to. He looked at him. Why didn't you? He thought about it, actually thought about it, which she'd noticed was a habit with him, the willingness to sit with a question for a moment before answering it. Because he was wrong, he said, and I can usually tell the difference. He climbed up to the wagon seat. She climbed up on the other side. They drove back through Millhaven in silence, and she stared at the road ahead and told herself that was enough, the fact that he could tell the difference, and tried to believe it would stay true when things got harder. Pruitt came 2 days later, alone this time, and he didn't come to the yard. He came to the fence line on the south side, where Clara was working with Jasper, and he stopped his horse on the far side and looked at her with the specific attention of a man conducting an inspection. "You're the woman," he said. "I'm a woman," she said. "Whether I'm the woman depends what you mean by it." Pruitt didn't smile. He was leaner than Burkett, with quick eyes and a way of holding his head slightly tilted, as if he were constantly calculating angles. "You're going to cause problems for Cole," he said. "That's not a threat. It's just what's going to happen. Then maybe you shouldn't add to it. I'm telling you as a courtesy." "Doesn't feel like courtesy," Jasper said without looking up from the post he was setting. Pruitt glanced at Jasper with mild irritation, then looked back at Clara. "This valley works because the people in it understand how things work. You're a complication nobody asked for." Clara set her hammer down on the fence post and turned to face him fully. "I'm a woman who's doing work that needs doing, on a ranch that needed another pair of hands. That's a complication. The problem isn't me." "That's a nice thing to believe," Pruitt said. He gathered his reins. "Just understand that people are watching." He rode off. Clara picked up her hammer again. Her hand was not entirely steady, and she noted this with the part of her mind that kept inventory of such things, that monitored herself for the signs of coming apart that she couldn't afford to show. She drove 3 nails in rapid succession and felt slightly better. "He controls the water rights on the south tributary," Jasper said when Pruitt was out of earshot. "I know. Cole's cattle need that water come spring thaw. It's never been an issue before, but now there's a reason to make it one," she said. Jasper nodded. He didn't say anything after that, and she didn't either. But the shape of the problem had clarified considerably, and it was larger than she'd initially understood. She'd walked into this valley carrying nothing but herself and Eli, and somehow in the space of a week she'd become a point around which something larger was organizing itself. She thought about what Cole had said. "I can usually tell the difference." She hoped he was right. She hoped his certainty would hold when it cost him more than a snub at the post office. She hoped, but hoping had not gotten her very far in the last 8 months, and she was not a woman who let hope substitute for preparation. That evening she asked Cole about the water rights. She laid it out plainly what Pruitt had said, what Jasper had told her, what she understood the implication to be. Cole listened with his usual stillness. When she finished, he said, "The agreement with Pruitt is verbal, been for 15 years. Then it could be withdrawn." It could. He was quiet. "I've been meaning to get something written down. Just there's always something more immediate." She looked at him. "How soon can we get to a land agent?" "Millhaven doesn't have one. Nearest is in Crest Falls, 2 days' ride. Then we should go." Cole studied her across the table. The lamp was between them, and it made shadows that shifted when the wind moved through the cracks in the walls. "Thinking 3 steps ahead," he said, and it wasn't quite an accusation, but it had some weight to it. "Someone has to. I do think ahead." "I know you do. I just." She stopped herself, recalibrated. "I think Pruitt's going to move faster than you're expecting. I think Burkett put an idea in his head, and Pruitt's the kind of man who acts on ideas." Another pause. Cole had a way of making his silences do work, and this one was doing a great deal. "I'll go to Crest Falls next week," he said. "This week would be better." He looked at her for a long moment. She held her ground, not combatively, just present, certain. The way she'd learned to be certain when everything else was uncertain, because someone in a situation needed to be. Thursday, he said. I'll leave Thursday. It wasn't this week, but it was closer to this week than next. Took it. Dolan left on a Wednesday, which surprised no one, but the manner of his leaving was the problem. He didn't tell Cole. He told Jasper he was going into town and didn't come back, and when Cole went to the bunkhouse the next morning, half the tack had gone with him: 2 good saddles, a set of bridles, a roping kit that Cole said had belonged to his father. Cole stood in the empty bunkhouse, looking at the space where the saddles had been, and he was quiet for a long time. I can go to the sheriff, Jasper offered. Dolan knows the sheriff, Cole said, in a tone that contained a specific history. Clara stood in the doorway and did the math. A man who hadn't come back to the ranch after Pruitt's visit. Missing's equipment, worth what she estimated was a significant amount. Sheriff, who apparently had some connection to Dolan. And Cole leaving tomorrow for Crest Falls, which would mean one day where the ranch was running with Jasper and herself, and nobody else, no Cole, no protection against whatever was being organized in the valley. Don't go to Crest Falls, she said. Cole turned and looked at her. Not yet. She came in from the doorway. Wait until we understand what Dolan was doing here and where he's gone. He didn't leave because he found something better. Men like that leave when they've finished what they came to do. What do you think he came to do? I don't know yet. She looked at the empty saddle racks. But I'd like to know before your 2 days ride away. Cole looked at Jasper. Jasper looked at the floor, which was his way of declining to have an opinion about something above his pay grade. Cole looked back at Clara. You think they planted him, he said. I think it's possible. Burkett's had men work on ranches before. It's happened in this valley. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd come to recognize as the external sign of an internal rearrangement. All right, I'll wait. 3 days later, a man from Crest Falls arrived at the ranch with a document that explained a great deal. It was a formal notice, stamped and signed, informing Cole Maddox that a complaint had been filed regarding the eastern boundary of his property, a complaint alleging that 200 acres of his prime grazing land had been incorrectly surveyed some years ago, and in fact legally belonged to the adjacent claim. The adjacent claim belonged to Burkett. Clara read the document twice. Cole read it once, and she watched his face while he did, and what she saw was not panic or defeat. It was the slow settling of something into place. The look of a man who had been suspecting something and was now confirmed in the suspicion and was already thinking about what came next. This is the accounting errors, she said. Yes. He needed you financially weakened before he made the land claim. If you'd already lost the $200 from Kellerman's overcharging, you'd have less to fight with. And if Dolan had taken the saddles and anything else he could manage, less still. Cole set the document on the table. How long have you been thinking about Burkett this way? Since he came to the yard, she said. Men like him don't come to give advice. They come to assess. He looked at her, with the expression she still didn't have a name for, not gratitude, not admiration. Something more complicated than either, the look of a person recalibrating a relationship to a situation that had just become both worse and more navigable at the same time. I need to get to Crest Falls, he said. Yes. Now we both need to go. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and the lamp between them flickered in the draft from the wall, and neither of them looked away. There was work to be done. That was the thing about this frontier. There was always work to be done, and the people who survived were the ones who kept doing it, even when the ground under their feet was not as solid as it had looked. Clara Whitmore had not come this far by waiting for things to get easier. She had come this far by being the person who was still standing when everything else had fallen, and whatever Burkett had set in motion, she intended to still be standing when it was done. They left for Crest Falls on a Friday, which meant leaving Jasper alone with the ranch for 2 days, which meant Clara spent the first hour of the ride going through everything that could go wrong and telling herself to stop. Even as I sat between her and Cole on the wagon seat, which had not been planned exactly, she'd intended to leave him with Jasper, But Eli had produced the specific kind of silence that 4-year-olds deploy when they have decided something and are waiting for the adults to catch up. And she'd looked at his face and thought about leaving him behind in a situation she didn't fully trust and put him in the wagon. Cole hadn't said anything about it. He'd adjusted his position on the seat to give Eli more room and picked up the reins. And that had been that. The road to Crest Falls was better than the trail she'd walked to reach the ranch, but not by much. It wound through a narrow canyon for the first 6 miles, the rock walls close enough on either side that the wagon's sounds came back at them slightly altered, and then opened onto a long plateau where the wind had nothing to stop it and made up for lost time. Eli asked approximately 40 questions about rocks, horses, clouds, why ravens were black, whether fish got cold in winter, and what the biggest animal Cole had ever seen was. Cole answered each one with the same measured patience he brought to everything, not warm exactly, but thorough, as if he'd decided the questions deserved real answers. Clarice listened to this and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't examine too closely. They made camp the first night in a draw that broke the wind, and she cooked over a small fire while Cole tended the horses and Eli collected rocks with the seriousness of a man conducting important research. After dinner, Eli fell asleep against her side with the absolute swiftness of young children, and she sat by the dying fire, looking at the dark outline of the canyon rim, while Cole sat on the other side, and after a while he said, "Tell me about the accounting you did before Owen." She considered the question. "My father kept books for 3 businesses in Laramie. I learned from him starting when I was about 9. He said it was the only skill that would serve me regardless of what my life looked like. Smart man. He was practical." She paused. He wasn't warm about it. He just understood that women don't get to depend on circumstances the way men sometimes can. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Owen didn't use your accounting." It wasn't a question, but she answered it. Owen didn't think he needed it. He had a lot of confidence in his own judgment. She looked at the fire. The problem with confidence is it doesn't correct itself when it's wrong. It just stays confident. I've known men like that. Most people have. The fire snapped and settled. An ember floated up and went dark. Eli made a small sound in his sleep and pushed his face further into her side. "What happened to your father?" Cole asked. "He died the year before I married Owen. Fever." She shifted slightly to better support Eli's weight. "I sometimes think that if he'd been alive, he would have seen Owen for what he was before I did. He had a very good eye for accounts, and men are just another kind of account." Cole looked at her across the fire with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one he got when something landed differently than he'd expected. "Is that how you see people? As accounts?" "No. But it's useful to know who's adding to something and who's drawing it down." He sat with that. The wind moved through the draw, quieter than it had been on the plateau, something almost reasonable about it down here, out of its full strength. "Which am I?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I haven't finished the accounting yet." He almost smiled. She saw at the beginning of it, and then it settled back into his usual expression. But it had been there, and she noted it the way she noted most things. Carefully, without making too much of it. Crest Falls was 3 times the size of Millhaven and had the slightly frantic energy of a town that knew it was growing and hadn't yet decided what it was growing into. The main street had a land office, 2 banks, a courthouse with a fresh coat of paint, and enough horses tied outside various establishments to suggest that business was being conducted. Cole knew where to go. He'd been here before, though not recently, and he drove the wagon directly to the land office without stopping. The agent was a man named Hardcastle, 50-ish, with the slightly harried look of someone managing more paper than he'd anticipated when he took the job. He shook Cole's hand and looked at Clara with polite uncertainty and looked at Eli with the expression adults produce when a child appears in a professional context and they are unsure of the protocol. "Mr. Maddox," Hardcastle said the boundary dispute. "Yes, I received your letter." "Sit down, please." They sat. Eli sat. Hardcastle spread papers across his desk, and Clara leaned forward before Cole did, because she'd been thinking about this for 3 days, and she had a specific order in which she wanted to approach it. "Can I see the original survey?" she asked. Hardcastle looked at her. The survey say that established the boundary when the land was first filed. The one Burkett's complaint is claiming was incorrect. Hardcastle looked at Cole. Cole said, "Mrs. Whitmore is handling the documentation side of things." Something passed across Hardcastle's face adjustment, recalibration, and then he turned back to his files and produced a document that had the yellowed look of something that had been in a drawer for many years. Clara read it carefully. The survey had been done 19 years ago by a man named T. Aldrich, and the measurements were precise and clearly recorded. She read the boundary description twice, checking the compass bearings against her memory of the ranch's physical layout. "This is correct," she said. "Burkett's claim says it isn't," Hardcastle said. "Burkett's claim says the line runs along the ridgeline. The original survey describes a straight line from the creek junction, which puts the boundary 40 yards west of the ridgeline." She set the document down and looked at Hardcastle. "Do you have Burkett's filing?" Hardcastle produced it. She read that too. It cited a subsequent survey done 6 years ago by someone named P. Garvey, a name she didn't recognize, that described the boundary differently. She compared the two documents side by side. "This second survey changed the baseline measurement point," she said. "Starts from the east face of the rock formation instead of the creek junction. That's what moves the line. The rock formation and the creek junction are close together," Hardcastle said. "Close together now. 6 years ago, there was flooding through that canyon. I looked at the records at the county office in Millhaven before we left. The creek shifted." She looked at him steadily. "If the creek shifted, the junction shifted. The original survey described a fixed measurement, the creek junction, as it existed when the survey was done. Burkett's surveyor used the shifted position to redraw the line." The room was quiet. Cole had been watching her and not saying anything, which she'd noticed was his way of handling situations he'd decided were better handled by whoever was best equipped for them. Hardcastle looked at both documents again. He was not a stupid man. She could see him following it, working through the geometry. "That's a significant accusation," he said slowly. "P. Garvey is a licensed surveyor. I'm sure he is," Clara said. "I'm just telling you what the documents say." Hardcastle rubbed his jaw. "I'd need to commission a new survey to settle this formally. Cost can be filed as part of the dispute," Cole said, speaking for the first time in 20 minutes. "If the original survey is found to be correct, Burkett bears the cost. Procedure, yes. Then start it." Hardcastle looked between them and nodded slowly, writing something in his ledger. Clara exhaled through her nose, very quietly, and did not allow herself any other visible expression of the relief she felt, because they were not done yet, and she had learned not to exhale too fully until a thing was actually finished. They had one more stop in Crest Falls. The bank. Cole's account was in Millhaven, but the bank in Crest Falls had correspondent relationships with most of the territory's financial institutions, and the manager was a man named Fells, who Cole knew slightly from a cattle transaction 2 years back. Cole asked to speak with him privately, and Fells took them into a back office with the careful courtesy of a man who understood that Cole Maddox was not a person to be kept in a lobby. Clara sat in the hall with Eli and listened to the muffled sound of their voices and waited. Eli had found a loose thread on her sleeve and was methodically unraveling it with the focused patience of someone engaged in genuinely interesting work. "Eli," she said. "It was already coming off," he said without looking up. She let him have the thread and looked at the bank's plastered wall and thought about Burkett, about Pruitt, about Dolan and the missing saddles and the carefully constructed financial erosion that had been intended to leave Cole too weak to defend a land claim, about the fact that someone had gone to considerable trouble over a period of years to set this in motion, which meant the 200 acres they were disputing were worth considerably more than 200 acres of grazing land ought to be. She was still thinking about this when Cole came back out. His expression told her something had happened. But not what. In the wagon, heading for the lodging house, at the end of the main street, He said, Burkett has a buyer. Clara looked at him. For the land? For a section of land that would include those 200 acres, plus some of his own. He's been negotiating with a railroad development company for the past 18 months. He kept his eyes on the road. The line they're planning would run straight through the disputed acres. Right-of-way purchase would be worth. He stopped. How much? She asked. He said a number that explained everything. It explained the years of patience, the careful erosion, Dolan, the timing of the survey complaint. You didn't do all of that over grazing land. You did it over a number like that. Clara sat with it for a moment. Eli was asleep between them again, his head against her arm, his breath slow and even. He's been planning this for years, she said. I think so. Did Fells know about the railroad? He'd heard something. Nothing confirmed. Cole's jaw had the set she'd come to associate with controlled anger. But he knew enough to tell me to get my documentation in order before the dispute went any further. Hardcastle won't move quickly, she said. The survey commission will take weeks. Burkett knows that too. She looked at the road ahead. The afternoon light was coming in sideways, the way it did in November, making everything look slightly flattened, slightly more serious than it might have looked in summer. He's going to do something else, she said. While we're waiting for the commission, he's not going to just wait. No, Cole said. He's not. They drove in silence for a block, and then she said, the water rights with Pruitt. Yes. That's the next pressure point. If he cuts your water access before spring thaw, you lose cattle. Weakened herd means you need money. Need money means the land dispute becomes a negotiation instead of a defense. Cole was quiet. You have to talk to Pruitt before Burkett does, she said. Pruitt's already been talked to by Burkett. That conversation happened weeks ago. Then you need to offer him something Burkett can't. Pruitt doesn't need money. I know. She looked at him. He needs something to stand behind. Burkett's been giving him permission to be difficult. You need to give him a reason to be straightforward. She paused. The water agreement? Has it ever been formalized? Verbal. 15 years. Does Pruitt's son run any part of the operation? Cole glanced at her. Younger son. Theo. He handles the south pasture. And does Theo have any stake in the written agreement? Or is it purely between you and Pruitt Sr.? Between me and Calhoun. Cole used Pruitt's first name, which told her something about the actual texture of the relationship. Theo doesn't have a formal stake in anything yet. That's the problem, she said. Calhoun is older. He's thinking about what Burkett's offering now. Theo is younger. He's thinking about what the valley looks like in 10 years. She kept her voice even. If you talk to them together and put something on paper that acknowledges Theo's future stake in the water arrangement, you give them both a reason to stay out of Burkett's orbit. Cole drove for almost a full minute without speaking. You've been thinking about this since Pruitt came to the fence line, he said. I've been thinking about it since Burkett came to the yard. Another silence. Longer this time. You're right, he said. Came out plainly, without the particular difficulty some men have with those two words. She'd noticed that about him, he was direct about his assessments, including of himself, and didn't dress the acknowledgement up in anything. He was wrong, or he was right, or he didn't know, and he said so. It was, she thought, an underrated quality. They were back at the ranch by Sunday evening. Jasper met them at the gate, looking like a man who had been waiting to say something since, approximately, the previous Thursday, and had been working on how to say it. Burkett sent someone, he said. Yesterday. Cole climbed down from the wagon. Who? Not anyone I recognized, young man. Came to the gate, asked to speak with you. I said you were away on business. He said he'd come back. Jasper paused. Also walked the fence line on the north side for about an hour before he left. I watched him from the ridge. Did he do anything? Not that I saw, but he had paper with him, was writing things down. Cole stood in the yard and looked at the fence line as if he could see through the dark to what was out there. Clara lifted Eli down from the wagon and held him against her shoulder. He'd woken up during the last mile and then slipped back to sleep in the way children do, heavy and warm. He's having it surveyed, she said informally. Before the official commission even starts. Building his own record. Cole said, building a record and looking for anything he can use. Any fence that's a few inches off, any marker that's been moved or weathered. She shifted Eli's weight. He'll find something. The fence line is old in places. He'll find something and use it. Cole looked at her. In the dark, with the lamplight from the barn behind him, his face was difficult to read. You're saying he'll manufacture evidence. I'm saying he'll take whatever's genuinely imprecise and describe it in whatever way serves his claim. She held his gaze. It might not be pure fabrication. It might be interpretation. It's harder to fight. Then we go back out there tomorrow, and we document exactly what we've got. Yes, every marker, every post, every measurement we can take. She shifted Eli again, and we need to do it before his man comes back. Jasper said, I can start before light. We'll all start before light, Cole said. They worked the next 3 days in a cold that got more serious each morning. Clara and Cole moved the fence lines systematically from the northeast corner, measuring and recording at every point. Cole had a surveyor's chain that had belonged to his father, and she made the notes while he took the measurements. And Jasper held the chain's far end with the unhurried reliability that characterized everything he did. The record they built was meticulous. It was also, she noted, a record that in 3 places showed fences that had settled and shifted slightly over years, in ways that were natural and documentable, but that a hostile interpreter could describe as encroachment. She wrote a precise description of each of the 3 problem points, the soil conditions that explained the settling, the age of the posts, the fact that the shift was inward rather than outward, meaning the fence was actually conceding ground rather than claiming it. She wrote it in the careful, specific language she'd learned from her father, the kind of language that was difficult to argue with because it wasn't making a case, it was only describing what was there. Cole read her notes at the end of the second day and looked up. You wrote this like a surveyor. I wrote it like an accountant, she said. Same principle. You describe what is, not what you'd like it to be, and you describe it with enough precision that there's nothing left to interpret. Where did you learn that? From a man who believed that the only protection a person really has is a clear record of the truth. She capped her pen. My father applied it to ledgers. It works for fence lines, too. Cole set the notes down. He'd been watching her throughout the 3 days in the way she'd noticed before, not intrusive, not obvious, but present, the way a person looks when they're learning something and know they're learning it. She didn't ask him what he was learning. Some things were better left to work themselves out without being named. Storms announced itself on the 3rd night. She felt it before she heard it, a change in the air pressure that she'd grown up recognizing, the particular drop that preceded a serious storm rather than just a cold snap. She lay in the back room listening to the wind, beginning to build, and did the calculation that any rancher's wife learned to do automatically. Cattle positions, fence integrity, the distance from the north pasture to the canyon where cattle sometimes drifted in bad weather and got themselves into trouble with the terrain. She got up and knocked on Cole's door. Storm, she said, when she heard him stir. Pause. How long? Maybe 2 hours before it's bad. Could be less. She heard him getting up. She went to the main room and built up the stove and put coffee on, because what came next was going to be long and cold, and the coffee would matter. Jasper appeared at the back door 5 minutes after Cole, already dressed, because Jasper had also felt it. North herd, Cole said. Canyon drift is the problem, Jasper said. I know, we need to move them before the wind gets the snow horizontal. Cole pulled his coat on. He looked at Clara. Stay with Eli. She'd expected this and had her answer ready. Eli is 4 years old and asleep. He's safer in a locked house by himself than the 3 of us are trying to move 1,200 head with 2 pairs of hands. She was already pulling on her coat. You need 3 people for this. Clara, I've moved cattle in bad weather. I know what I'm doing. She looked at him directly. The way she'd learned to look at him when she needed him to see her clearly, rather than seeing the category he sometimes still defaulted to. Don't waste time arguing about it. He looked at her for a moment that was slightly too long for a purely practical calculation. Then he grabbed his hat. Stay between me and Jasper. If you lose sight of either of us, stop and wait. Don't try to navigate the canyon alone. Understood, and if you can't keep up, I'll keep up. He held her gaze for one more second, and then turned and went out, and she followed. The wind outside was already serious. It had the quality of intention, the kind of cold that didn't feel like weather so much as an argument. She pulled her hat down hard and kept Cole's lantern in her sight as they crossed the yard and into the dark beyond. Cattle were restless. She could hear them. Before she could see them, that particular low collective sound of animals, registering something in the air that the humans around them had only just noticed. Jasper went wide to the right flank, and Cole moved to the center, and she took the left, because the left side of the herd had the natural tendency to drift toward the canyon when spooked, and she knew this because she'd spent 3 days studying the lay of the land while they were documenting the fence line. The work was physical, in the way that strips away everything except the task. Wind, cold, the sound of cattle, and the sound of the snow, beginning to come in earnest, the lamplight swinging, and the particular intelligence required to read a herd's movement and anticipate where the gaps would form and close them before the animals found their way through. She'd done this. She knew this. Her body remembered it, even when her mind was still finding its footing. She drove the left flank hard for 40 minutes, keeping the drift away from the canyon mouth. Her horse working with the reliable willingness of a well-trained animal that knows its job. Twice the line wavered, and she pushed it back. Snow was horizontal now. Cole had been right about that, and she navigated by sound as much as sight, the herd's sound, the wind's direction, the occasional shout from Cole or Jasper that told her where they were. Canyon mouth was the danger point. Get them past that, and the terrain opened up enough that the cattle would naturally move toward the lower pasture and shelter. She'd identified this 3 days ago, while walking the fence line, had filed it away without knowing why exactly, some instinct telling her the information might matter. Push the flank. The snow came harder. She pushed. And then the shout from Cole's direction changed quality, shorter, sharper, a sound that wasn't instruction, but, something else, and she wheeled her horse and looked toward the center of the herd and saw the lantern go down. She found him at the edge of a wash she hadn't known was there, a 10-foot drop that the snow had made invisible. His horse had shied at the edge and thrown him, and he'd gone down the bank into the frozen wash and landed badly. She could hear him. He was conscious, swearing with the controlled intensity of a man who is hurt and knows it, and is evaluating the damage, which meant he was alive, which was the first thing. She got down the bank sideways, using the brush for handholds, and reached him in the dark. Her lantern found his face, and she read it fast, the way he was holding his left arm, the position of his leg, the particular set of his jaw. Left arm or shoulder? She asked. Shoulder, dislocated, I think. He tried to move, and she heard him stop himself. Don't. She looked at his leg. Can you move the leg? He moved it. It moved, she exhaled. Good. The arm I can manage. The leg was the problem. The herd Jasper has it. He knows what to do. She wasn't certain of this, but uncertainty wasn't useful right now. I need you to lean against the bank and let me work with the shoulder. You know how to. My father dislocated his shoulder twice. My mother dealt with it both times and showed me because she said it was the sort of thing worth knowing. She moved beside him and got her hands where she needed them, feeling the joint carefully. He was tense. She could feel it through his whole body. That controlled bracing of a man who was trying not to show how much something hurt. Breathe out, she said, all the way. When your breath is all the way out, it goes easier. He breathed. She felt him try to comply, the tension partially releasing. She said it. He made a sound that wasn't a word, short and hard, and then it was done, and she heard the change in his breathing, the specific relief of a joint back in place, which is not the absence of pain, but is a different quality of it, manageable rather than impossible. Thank you, he said after a moment. His voice was rough. Can you get up the bank? Yes. He couldn't do it easily. She helped him up, her hands, finding the places where she could be useful without making him feel handled. which was a specific skill, and one she'd developed with Owen in better years, when he'd let her help him without interpreting it as an accusation. Cole accepted the help, without comment, without diminishment, without the particular stiffening some men produce when they need to be aided by someone they've been accustomed to not needing. They got to the top of the bank. His horse had bolted, gone somewhere in the storm, would come back when the weather broke. He was on foot. "Take my horse," she said. "The herd needs. Take the horse and get to the east side where Jasper can see you. I'll manage on foot from here." She looked at him in the lantern light. His face was wet from snow and pale from pain, but his eyes were clear and present. "Canyon mouth is behind me. The drift risk is managed. I just need to hold the left flank steady for another 20 minutes, and they'll move natural from there." In this weather. On foot. Cole. She looked at him with the same expression she'd used in every difficult moment since she'd walked through his gate, the one that said she knew what she was doing and she needed him to know it too. "Give me the lantern and take the horse." He looked at her for a moment that was brief but complete, the kind of moment in which a significant amount of information travels without words. Then he handed her the lantern, and she gave him the reins, and she turned back into the dark and the snow and went to do the work that needed doing. She held the left flank for 25 minutes, not 20. The last 5 were difficult in ways she didn't let herself fully register, until afterward, the cold getting into her hands through her gloves, the wind making it hard to know direction. One moment where she lost the sound of the herd for about 30 seconds, that felt considerably longer than 30 seconds. Found it again. She kept moving. When the herd finally cleared the canyon mouth and the terrain opened up, and she heard Jasper's voice from somewhere in the dark ahead, calling the cattle down toward lower ground, she stopped walking and stood in the snow and let herself feel how tired she was. All at once, the full weight of it landing on her at the same moment the danger lifted. Then she kept walking, because standing still in a Wyoming blizzard is its own kind of danger. And she had a child asleep in a locked house who needed his mother to come back. She got back to the ranch house an hour before dawn. Cole was already there. He'd seen to his shoulder, and to Jasper, and to the horses, and was sitting at the table with coffee and the expression of a man who had been waiting and had been trying not to show that he was waiting. She hung up her coat and her hat and sat down across from him. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noted without judgment. They'd earned it. Poured her coffee without being asked, and pushed it across the table. "The herd?" she asked. All present, Jasper counted twice. He looked at her. His shoulder was bound. She could see the improvised sling, and there was a cut above his eye she hadn't noticed in the dark. Small but dried now, and dark. "Are you all right?" "I will be." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Give me 10 minutes." He gave her the 10 minutes. Sat across from her in the lamplight while the storm continued outside, and the house held against it, which it did solidly, because it was a house built by a man who'd understood that Wyoming storms don't make exceptions for houses they find inadequate. After the 10 minutes, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she finally had a name for. It wasn't calculation or reluctance or gratitude or admiration. It was something simpler and more difficult than any of those things, and it had been building in small increments since the morning she'd told him about the accounting errors. And the name for it was recognition, the particular way a person looks when they've found something they didn't know they were looking for, and are only now beginning to understand what that means. She looked back at him steadily. She was too tired and too cold and too honest in this moment for anything else. "Thank you," he said, "for the herd, for the shoulder." For he stopped, started again, for all of it. "The herd needed saving," she said. "Your shoulder needed setting. Those are just facts, Clara." She waited. "Not everything is just facts," he said. The lamp between them flickered, same as it had in the canyon and on the trail, and every night at this table since she'd arrived. Storm pressed against the walls. Inside it was warm in the imperfect, slightly drafty way of frontier houses that do their best. She held her coffee cup and looked at Cole Maddox and thought about what it meant that she was here, in this house, on this side of everything that had tried to stop her, and that the man across the table had just said something true that neither of them knew quite what to do with yet. "No," she said finally, "not everything." She drank her coffee. He drank his. The storm went on for several more hours, but inside it was warm, and Eli slept undisturbed in the back room, and the herd was safe in the lower pasture, and the work that was waiting for them when the storm broke was considerable. Burkett, Pruitt, the Survey Commission, the railroad money, all of it still out there, still requiring attention and strategy and documents written in precise, careful language that couldn't be argued with. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight they had survived what the storm had sent, and that was enough to sit with for now. The storm left 4 things behind: 8 inches of snow, 2 fence sections down on the east side, a dislocated shoulder that Cole was pretending bothered him less than it did, and a silence between him and Clara that had a different quality than the silences before. She noticed it and didn't name it. There were enough things requiring attention without naming that. The fence came first. She and Jasper worked through the morning after the storm, while Cole managed what he could one-handed, which was more than she'd expected, and less than he wanted it to be. He'd accepted the sling she'd made for him with the same plainness with which he accepted most things that came from her, without excess gratitude, without the particular performance of reluctance that would have been its own kind of commentary. He just put it on and went to work. By afternoon, the fence was up, and they were back inside, and she was at the table with the documentation from Crest Falls spread out in front of her, working through what they had and what they still needed. The Survey Commission would take time. Hardcastle had said weeks, and that was assuming Burkett didn't find ways to complicate the process, which he would. She was certain of that, the way she was certain of weather, not because she could see it yet, but because everything in the pattern pointed that direction. She was still working when Cole came in from the yard, stood at the stove to warm his hands, and said without preamble, "I'm going to see Calhoun Pruitt tomorrow." She looked up. "Alone? You think I shouldn't go alone. I think you should take me." He turned from the stove. "Why?" "Because Pruitt has already decided how to handle a conversation with you. He's had weeks to prepare that conversation, but he hasn't prepared a conversation that includes me." She held his gaze. "People say different things when the expected dynamic shifts. I want to see what he says when it shifts." Cole considered this for a moment. In the early days, she thought he would have argued with it on principle, not because he disagreed, but because accepting the reasoning required acknowledging that she saw angles he hadn't fully mapped. He'd moved past that, mostly. Not entirely, because he was human, and people don't move past things entirely, but mostly. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow morning." Pruitt Ranch was smaller than Cole's, but better maintained in the particular way of operations, run by men who care more about appearance than acreage. The fences were painted. The yard was raked even in November. Calhoun Pruitt met them at the door of the main house with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and had rehearsed his position thoroughly. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now carried the subtle authority of a man accustomed to being right. He looked at Clara with the particular brand of puzzled display she'd come to recognize, the look of a man who'd constructed a mental picture of a situation and is annoyed to find a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Mr. Maddox," he said, "I heard about your shoulder." "News travels," Cole said. "This valley is small." His eyes moved to Clara. He didn't say anything directly, which was itself a statement. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, and extended her hand, which forced the social equation forward in a direction he hadn't initiated. He shook it briefly. "Come in." The inside of the Pruitt house was the opposite of Cole's, full of furniture, decorative pieces, a rug in the main room that looked like it had come a long way to be there. A younger man was standing near the fireplace with the careful posture of someone trying to seem less attentive than he was. He had his father's coloring, but a different cast to his face, less settled, more alert to the possibility that the world was not entirely decided. "My son, Theo," Pruitt said. Cole nodded. Theo nodded back. Clara looked at Theo for a moment and thought, There, Pruitt had coffee already prepared, which told her this conversation had been anticipated. The question was which conversation he'd anticipated. She was here to change that. For the first 10 minutes, the exchange was courteous and entirely about nothing. Weather, cattle losses in the storm, the state of the road to Crest Falls. Cole handled this with his usual patience, which was genuine rather than calculated. He'd grown up in this valley and understood that certain conversations had to arrive at their subject in their own time. Clara sat quietly and watched Theo, who was trying not to show he was watching her. When Pruitt finally moved toward the subject, a careful sideways approach about the current situation in the valley and men in his position having to make difficult considerations, Clara let Cole handle the first part of it. Cole presented their position on the land dispute clearly and without excess drama, the way he did most things. Pruitt listened and offered the responses he'd prepared, which were composed and non-committal and designed to leave all options open. Then Clara said, "Mr. Pruitt, can I ask you something directly?" Pruitt looked at her with the wary curiosity of a man who prefers the pace to stay where he's set it. "You can ask." "The water agreement you have with Cole, the one that's been verbal for 15 years. When Burkett approached you about it, what exactly did he offer you?" The room changed. Not dramatically. Nobody moved, nobody's expression broke completely, but the quality of the air shifted, the way it shifts when something unsaid suddenly occupies the center of a conversation. Pruitt said, "I'm not sure that's He offered you something," Clara said. Not unkindly, just clearly. He wouldn't have approached you otherwise because approaching you was a risk. If you declined and told Cole, Burkett's plan became visible too early. So whatever he offered had to be substantial enough that he was confident you'd hear it favorably. She paused. Was it money, or was it the railroad? Theo made a small sound near the fireplace. Not a word, just a sound. Pruitt looked at Clara for a long moment with an expression that was cycling through several things: irritation, calculation, and underneath both of those, something that might have been a reluctant reassessment. "The railroad right-of-way would run adjacent to my south pasture," he said, finally, not admitting to what Burkett had offered, just establishing a fact. The right-of-way purchase would be significant. "For Burkett," Clara said, "the 200 acres he's claiming are in the direct path. Your south pasture is adjacent, but not in the path. The railroad would pass your land, Mr. Pruitt. It wouldn't cross it." Another silence. She watched him processing this and saw the moment he arrived at the implication. "He told you the right-of-way would go through your land," she said quietly. Pruitt's jaw tightened very slightly. He implied the boundary, once corrected, would position my south fence line inside the right-of-way purchase area. But the original survey would put the boundary 40 yards west of where Burkett's claiming it, which means your south fence isn't in the purchase area regardless of the dispute outcome. She kept her voice even. "He told you something that wasn't true, or that he knew to be uncertain and described as certain." Fire crackled. Theo had stopped pretending not to listen. Cole was still, the particular stillness of a man who has decided to let a thing play out. Pruitt sat with his coffee cup and looked at it, and did not immediately say anything. And in that silence, Clara watched a man rearranging his understanding of a situation he'd believed he'd already settled. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't clean. He was a proud man, and proud men don't enjoy discovering they've been managed, and she didn't try to make it easier by filling the quiet with reassurance. Finally, Pruitt looked at Cole, not at Clara. At Cole. "You brought her to tell me this." "She knew what to tell you," Cole said. "I knew enough to bring her." Pruitt looked back at Clara with something that had finally cleared of its initial hostility, not to friendliness, but to a kind of direct attention that felt more honest than what had come before. "What do you want from this conversation, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I want the water agreement in writing," she said. "A formal arrangement that acknowledges the access as established, describes its terms clearly, and names Theo as a party to it so it survives any change in the operations management." She paused. "I want it done before Burkett comes back with another version of what he's offering, because the next version will be more carefully constructed than the last. Pruitt looked at his son. Theo was looking at Clara with an expression she recognized the look of a younger person, encountering an older person's competence and finding it unexpectedly clarifying. "She's right, father," Theo said. Pruitt made a sound that wasn't agreement, but wasn't refusal. He set down his coffee. "I'd want a lawyer in Crest Falls to draft it." "So would we," Clara said. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon light, and Cole was quiet for the first mile in the way that meant he was working something out. She let him work it out. The cold was less brutal than it had been a relatively mild day by Wyoming November standards, the sun actually present and doing what it could. "Theo," Cole said eventually. "He's going to run that operation in 10 years, Clara said. "Calhoun knows it. Getting Theo's name on the agreement gives the whole family a stake in honoring it." "Where did you learn to do that?" She thought about it. "I don't know that I learned it anywhere specific. I look at a room and I try to understand who has what to gain and what they're afraid of losing." She adjusted her coat against the wind. Ket assumed Pruitt was purely a financial calculation. He wasn't. He was a father thinking about his son's future. Those are different levers. Cole considered this. You saw Theo right away. He was trying very hard not to be seen. Cole glanced at her with something almost amused in it. "You do that too." She looked straight ahead at the road. "I have reasons to." "I know you do." He didn't pursue it further, which she appreciated. He had a way of approaching the edge of personal territory and then not crossing it, not from lack of interest, but from a kind of respect for where the lines were. They were close enough to the ranch that she could see the chimney smoke when he said, "The agreement with Pruitt, if we get it in writing, and the Survey Commission rules in our favor, that takes care of 2 of the 3 problems. Kellerman's overcharging is the 3rd. Kellerman is on the county board." "I know." She'd been thinking about this since the first night she'd found the discrepancies in the ledger. Kellerman was connected in ways that made a direct complaint complicated. County board had oversight of local contracts, land filings, commercial disputes. Going after Kellerman meant going after a man who had a hand in the systems you'd need to use to go after him. "The overcharges are documented," she said. 3 years of receipts against ledger entries. That's not a matter of opinion. No. But taking it to the board means taking it to people who work with Kellerman regularly. "Yes, so we don't take it to the board," she said. Cole looked at her. "We take it to the county surveyor's office in Crest Falls. The same office, handling the boundary dispute. The same records." She organized it as she spoke, the way she did when she was working through something that was clarifying in real time. Kellerman's feed store has county contracts for supply to public lands. The overcharging in his private transactions is consistent with overcharging on county contracts, and I'd bet it is, because men like that rarely separate their habits. Then, the surveyor's office has grounds to refer it to the territorial auditor. That's a different level than the county board. A different level entirely. Cole stopped the wagon at the gate and looked at her. The late light was coming in at a low angle, and it made everything look slightly warmer than it was. "You've been building this whole time," he said. "Since the first night you looked at the ledgers." "I've been doing accounts," she said. "It's what I know how to do." "No, Clara." He waited until she looked at him. "I want you to understand something." She waited. "When I brought you and Eli inside that first night, I didn't think." He stopped himself, started again with the directness that was native to him. "I wasn't doing you a favor. I want to be clear about that. Whatever this has become, I wasn't in a position to do anyone a favor. I was a man alone on a ranch that was being systematically undermined by people I hadn't fully seen clearly, and you walked through that gate and started seeing it within the first week." He held her gaze. "So when I say thank you, I'm not saying it the way a man says it to someone who helped him out. I'm saying it the way you say it when something actually changed." She sat with this. The late light, the chimney smoke, the particular weight of being seen clearly by someone who had been paying real attention. "You lit the stove," she said, "on that first night. You didn't have to do that. It was cold. I know. But you did it anyway." She looked at him. "That's where it started for me. A man who lit the stove. He held her gaze for a moment that had the quality of something finally landing after a long flight. Then he climbed down from the wagon and opened the gate, and she drove the wagon through. And he closed the gate and climbed back up, and they went the rest of the way to the house in a silence that was not empty at all. Kellerman came to the ranch 3 days later, not alone. He brought a man from the county board named Swick, who had the practiced neutrality of a bureaucrat who has learned to look impartial while serving a specific function, and a younger man who turned out to be Kellerman's nephew and who had the specific nervousness of someone who knows more about a situation than he's supposed to show. Clara saw them coming from the fence line where she was working with Jasper, and she went straight to the house and got the ledger copies she'd made before they'd left for Crest Falls copies, because she was not going to have original documents in a room with Kellerman, and she was at the table with them when Cole brought the 3 men inside. Kellerman was larger than she'd expected, well-dressed for a ranch visit, which told her this was a performance. His face was broad and reddish, and he had the bluff good humor of a man who had found that people were easier to manage if they were laughing. He looked at her with immediate attention, the kind that calculates, that recalibrates, that arrives quickly at a strategy. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, as though he knew exactly who she was and had come specifically to address that fact. "I've been hearing about you." "I imagine you have," she said. He sat down without being asked, which established something about how he intended this meeting to go. Swick sat beside him. The nephew stayed near the door. "I understand there's been some confusion about the accounts between my store and Cole's ranch," Kellerman said. His tone was the friendly, slightly disappointed tone of a man who has come to clear up a misunderstanding between people he respects. Figures get transposed. Records don't always match up the way they should. "I'm sure if we look at the original receipts, together we can get this sorted out quickly." "We have the original receipts," Clara said. She opened the ledger copy to the first marked page and turned it toward him. "This is the receipt from January of last year. This is the corresponding ledger entry in Cole's accounts. The discrepancy is here," she pointed. $62. Kellerman looked at it with the expression of a man performing careful consideration. "Handwriting errors. The receipt is in your handwriting, Mr. Kellerman. The ledger entry is in yours as well. The number on the receipt and the number in the ledger are different." She turned to the next marked page. "This is March of the year before." Swick leaned forward and looked at the documents. Whatever performance he'd been prepared to give had encountered something he hadn't been briefed to expect: actual documentation, laid out in order, specific and cross-referenced, and not the kind of thing you dismiss by talking around it. "The total across 3 years is $214, Clara said. "I can show you each instance individually or summarize by year, whichever is more useful." Kellerman looked at her. Friendly disappointment had gone somewhere more guarded. "These are copies." "The originals are in Crest Falls," she said, "with the county surveyor's office." The room shifted again, the same way it had shifted in Pruitt's house when she'd asked about Burkett's offer. Swick turned his head slightly toward Kellerman. The nephew by the door stopped looking at the floor. "Surveyor's office," Kellerman said. "They're reviewing all documentation related to the boundary dispute. The accounting records were relevant context." She looked at him steadily. "They also asked about the county supply contracts, which I understand your store holds several of. I wasn't able to speak to those specifically since I only have access to Cole's accounts, but I gave them what I had." This was partly true. She had submitted the documents. The surveyor's office had received them. Whether they'd yet looked at the county contracts was something she didn't know, and Kellerman didn't need to know she didn't know. Kellerman sat very still for a moment. Then the bluff good humor came back, more deliberate now, less natural. "I'm sure there's been an honest mistake somewhere in all this," he said. "My records going back 3 years are considerable. It's possible something got entered incorrectly on our end." "Possible," Clara said. "I'd be happy to issue a correction. Credit against future purchases. A refund would be more appropriate," she said. Credit assumes a future business relationship, and Cole will want to consider that separately. Cole, who had been standing near the window, watching this exchange with his arms crossed, said simply cash. Kellerman looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him without expression. I'll need to review my records, Kellerman said. Of course, Clara said. Hardcastle at the land office in Crest Falls can coordinate the transfer once you've completed your review. I've already informed him it may be coming. She hadn't, but it was the kind of thing that would happen. Once she wrote the letter she'd already drafted in her head. And the distinction between has been done and will be done when you intend to do it immediately was, in her opinion, a matter of administrative timing rather than honesty. Kellerman stood. Swick stood. The nephew by the door already had his hand on the latch. The meeting, which Kellerman had arrived, intending to conduct on his terms, had lasted 12 minutes and had gone in precisely the direction he had not planned. At the door, Kellerman stopped and looked back at her. You're a thorough woman, Mrs. Whitmore. I keep good records, she said. After they were gone, the sound of their horses fading down the approach, Jasper said from the corner where he'd been making himself useful with a piece of harness repair. I didn't know you'd told the surveyor's office about the county contracts. I'm going to write that letter this afternoon, Clara said. Jasper looked at the ceiling. Ah. Cole made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in that neighborhood and turned back to the window. The letter from Hardcastle came 2 weeks later. The Survey Commission had completed its preliminary review, and the findings were what Clara had predicted. The original survey was correct, the T. Aldrich measurements were validated by the new commission, and Burkett's subsequent survey by P. Garvey was flagged for further review on the grounds of procedural irregularities in the baseline measurement methodology. No formal ruling yet, but the language of the letter made the direction clear. Cole read it twice and handed it to her. She read it once. Garvey, she said. Do you know him? I know of him. He works out of Crest Falls. Does survey work for several of the larger operations? For Burkett? This would be the first I'm aware of. She set the letter down. Burkett paid for a survey that came out the way he needed it to come out. That's useful to know, but it doesn't help us directly unless Garvey's other surveys show the same methodology. It's not something we can access. Not easily. She tapped the letter. But the surveyor's office can, and they've already flagged the methodology. If they pull Garvey's other work as part of the review, and if the irregularity is consistent, then it becomes a pattern, and a pattern is a different problem than a disputed boundary. Cole looked at her. You think Burkett's done this before? I think a man who plans as carefully as Burkett, over as many years as he's apparently been planning this, didn't develop the methodology for one parcel. She straightened the letter. I think those 200 acres are not the only place in this territory where a boundary has been helpfully redrawn. They sat with this for a moment. The fire in the stove was doing its work. Outside, the December cold was settling in, more serious than November had been, the kind of cold that announces it intends to stay. That's true, Cole said slowly. Then this isn't our problem to solve. No, it becomes the territory's problem. She met his eyes. We just need to make sure the territory knows where to look. She wrote the second letter that night, after Eli was asleep and Cole had gone to check on the horses. It was addressed to Hardcastle, and it was careful and specific, and it suggested, in the plain language of someone simply describing what the documents showed, that a review of other surveys conducted by P. Garvey in the past decade might be relevant to the Commission's current investigation. She sealed it and set it on the table to go with the morning mail, and sat in the lamplight and looked at the wall for a while, and let herself feel the shape of what was happening. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than that. The satisfaction of work done right, which is different from victory, and more durable. Burkett came himself in the third week of December, not with Swick this time. Alone, which she hadn't expected a man who operated through intermediaries coming to the source directly, was a sign that the intermediaries had stopped being sufficient. He came in the early afternoon on a gray day that couldn't decide whether to snow and split the difference by producing a cold drizzle that got inside everything. Cole was out at the far pasture. She was in the house with Eli when she heard the horse in the yard and looked out the window and recognized the thick, well-fed silhouette. She put on her coat and went outside. Burkett looked at her from horseback with the expression of a man who has revised his assessment of a situation multiple times and is still not entirely satisfied with where the revisions have led him. "Is Cole here?" "He'll be back in an hour," she said. "You're welcome to wait, or I can take a message." He looked at her for a moment, then dismounted. He was a big man on the ground, taller than she'd realized from a distance, with the physical presence of someone accustomed to having it noticed. He tied his horse to the rail and looked at her with something that had dropped the community leader manner he'd used with Cole in the yard back in November. "You've been busy?" he said. "I've been working," she said. "The surveyor's office. Kellerman, Pruitt." He said the names flatly as items in an inventory. "You've been working against my interests specifically." "I've been working for the accuracy of the records," she said. "If that conflicts with your interests, the problem is with your interests, not the records." He looked at her without the hostility she'd expected. What she saw instead was something more unsettling, a kind of flat, evaluating attention, the look of a man who has accepted that a situation has changed and is now calculating new options. "What do you want?" he said. "I want the land dispute resolved in accordance with the original survey," she said. "I want the accounting irregularities corrected. I want a written water agreement between Cole and the Pruitts." She looked at him steadily. "Those things are already in motion. I'm not asking your permission. I'm asking what it would take to make this go away," he said. Not aggressively, as a genuine inquiry. "It's not going away," she said. "Not the way you mean. The commission will rule. Garvey's methodology is going to be reviewed. Kellerman has already indicated he'll be issuing a correction." She paused. "What happens to you after that depends on what the review of Garvey's other surveys finds." Implication landed. She saw it in the small tightening around his eyes. "I don't know what you're suggesting," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm describing what the surveyor's office is doing." She looked at him with the direct, clear attention she'd developed over months of navigating men who were accustomed to not being looked at directly by women. "Mr. Burkett, I walked into this valley with $4 and a child and a suitcase. I'm not going to be moved by a man on a horse." Something shifted in his expression, not quite respect, but its rough cousin, the grudging acknowledgement that he'd miscalculated the nature of what he was dealing with. He untied his horse, mounted without hurry. "Tell Cole I came by," he said. "Course," he wrote out. She stood in the drizzle and watched him go, and felt her hands shaking, which she did not permit herself to show until he was through the gate, and the sound of his horse had faded. Then she went inside and sat at the table and pressed her palms flat against the surface and breathed until the shaking stopped. It wasn't fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the aftermath of something that had required every steady, clear part of herself to hold its shape, and now that the requirement had lifted, the parts were settling back into their normal configuration, and they needed a moment. When Cole came back from the pasture and she told him what had happened, he stood in the doorway in his wet coat and listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she could hear the drizzle on the roof. "He came alone," Cole said. "Yes, that's not what he does. He came inside and hung his coat. He came to see you." "I know. He wanted to know what he was actually dealing with." Cole sat at the table across from her. "Did he find out?" She looked at him. "I think so." Cole nodded slowly. "Good." Eli appeared from the back room in the particular way he had of appearing in doorways without announcement, holding a piece of wood he'd been using as some kind of tool in whatever project occupied him currently, and looked between the two adults with the evaluating gaze he'd developed over months of living in a house where adult conversations sometimes had weight to them. "Is everything all right?" he asked. At 4.5, he'd learned to read rooms. "Everything's fine," Clara said. Cole looks serious, Eli said. Cole often looks serious, she said. Cole looked at Eli. I'm thinking, he said. About what? About how things are going to be, Cole said, from here on. Eli considered this with the solemnity he applied to important subjects. But is it going to be good? Cole looked at the boy for a moment, the Owen gray eyes and the Clara-set face, the 4-year-old's seriousness, the piece of wood held like a tool. And then he looked at Clara, and the expression she'd named recognition was there again, clearer than it had been before, no longer uncertain about what it was seeing. Yes, Cole said. I think it's going to be good. It was not a small thing, the way he said it. It was not a reassurance offered to a child to make the child feel better. It was the answer of a man who had looked at the actual evidence and arrived at an actual conclusion. Eli accepted this and went back to his project. Clara looked at Cole, and Cole looked at Clara, and outside the drizzle had finally made up its mind to become snow, coming down in the quiet, settled way of snow that intended to stay, covering the yard and the fence line and the approach and the gate in the same unhurried white, making the world look briefly like a thing that could be started again from a clean surface. Kellerman letter came through in January. The money arrived in February, which was slower than it should have been, but faster than she'd expected, given the number of people between the decision and the actual transfer of funds. $214, paid to Cole Maddox in full, with no accompanying explanation. The water agreement was signed by Calhoun Pruitt and Theo Pruitt and Cole Maddox in Crest Falls on Tuesday, in late January, with a lawyer named Birch who had a methodical mind and charged reasonable rates and described the arrangement in language that would not require interpretation later. Clara sat in Birch's office and read every paragraph before Cole signed anything, and Birch watched her do this with the expression of a professional who appreciates thoroughness in others. The Survey Commission issued its ruling in March. The original boundary was confirmed. The Garvey survey was invalidated. A separate review of 3 other Garvey surveys in the territory was opened, which was not Clara's problem to manage, but which she had made possible, and which was, she thought, probably the most durable part of everything she'd done. Burkett did not contest the ruling directly. He retreated in the way that certain powerful men retreat when they understand the consequence of continuing not with admission, not with visible defeat, but with the slow redirection of attention to other things, other plans, other valleys where the records were less precise and the people less stubborn. She heard later, through Jasper's web of connections, that Garvey had relocated to another territory. She never found out specifically what the review of his other surveys had uncovered, and she told herself that was fine, that a person can't track every consequence of every action, that some things have to be trusted to their own momentum. The valley did not transform overnight. The people who had doubted Clara didn't one day wake up certain of her. Some of them adjusted. Some didn't. Burkett's name still had weight in certain conversations. And there were people in Millhaven who would always be more comfortable with the story of a struggling woman who owed her survival to a generous man than with the more complicated version that was actually true. But Harold Greer, she noticed, was considerably more attentive the next time she came into his store. He didn't mention the credit he'd refused in November. She didn't either. Some accounts were settled by documentation, and some were settled by the simple passage of time and the accumulation of observable facts. And she understood by now that the second kind were no less real. She and Cole had a conversation in March, after the ruling came through, that was specific and direct and covered what the next year would look like and what the arrangement between them was or was becoming. It was not the most graceful conversation either of them had. Cole said some things in the wrong order and had to backtrack, and she said one thing she had to clarify because it had come out harder than she'd meant it. But they got through it, and on the other side of it was something that had been named and therefore became more real than unnamed things, which are real in their own way but carry a different kind of weight. Eli, for his part, had already resolved the question to his satisfaction some weeks earlier. He had taken to calling Cole by his first name with the uncomplicated confidence of a child who has decided a person is simply part of the world as it is, which is its own kind of verdict. The ranch was still imperfect. The fence on the north side needed work every season. The stove in the main room had a draft issue that Cole had been meaning to address since before Clara arrived. The accounting was clean and accurate now, but the work of a ranch is unending, and clean accounts don't repair themselves when prices shift or weather turns or a calf is lost to the cold. None of that was going away. It was just the shape of the work. Clara understood that better than most people would ever need to. She'd been understanding it since the first morning she'd watched Cole break ice in the water trough and decided to stop waiting to see what kind of he was and simply pay attention. And over months of paying attention, she had learned that the kind of man who breaks ice and lights, stoves, and says we'll try it and means it, kind of man who listens to a woman's accounting of a problem without needing to arrive there himself first, kind of man who tells a 4-year-old honestly that things are going to be good. That kind of man is rarer than the frontier would like to admit, and worth the careful accounting she had given him. The valley was still watching. But what it was watching had changed, and that change was permanent. And Clara Whitmore had learned a long time ago that permanent things don't require defense. They just require maintenance, same as everything else. Spring came to the valley the way it always did in Wyoming, not gently, not with any particular consideration for the people who had been waiting on it. Came in fits and arguments. A warm week, followed by a cold snap that killed the early growth, then a hard rain that turned the approach to the ranch into something that required planning to cross. And then one morning, Clara walked out to the fence line, and the air had changed, definitively and without announcement. And the ground was doing what ground does when it finally means to be warm. She stood there for a moment, just breathing it. Past 4 months had been the kind of work that doesn't look like much from the outside letters written, documents filed, meetings attended, numbers verified and re-verified, but had the density of something structural, something that had to be built before anything else could be built on top of it. Survey Commission ruling was the last formal piece, and when it came through in March, it had the quality of a door, finally closing on a room she'd been standing half inside for too long. Spring was its own beginning, and beginnings always required you to look forward rather than back at the door. The cattle needed to be moved from the lower pasture, where they'd wintered, to the upper grazing sections, which meant 3 days of work for all 4 of them herself, Cole, Jasper, and a new hand Cole had taken on in February named Gus, who was 17, and had the earnest reliability of a young man who understood he was being given a chance and didn't intend to waste it. He reminded her a little of how she imagined Cole had been at 17, though she kept this observation to herself, because Cole would have found it either amusing or embarrassing, and she hadn't yet decided which. Eli, who was now closer to 5 than 4, and had opinions about this, insisted on helping with the cattle move and was assigned to Jasper, which was a good assignment, because Jasper had the patience for a child's questions without needing to perform that patience. She watched them ride out together. In the early morning light, Eli, on the small brown mare Cole had acquired in February, with no specific announcement about why, and she thought about the distance between the boy who had held her coat in Harold Greer's store and the boy who rode a horse like he'd been doing it his whole life, which was essentially true. Cole came to stand beside her. He watched them too. "He's going to be fine on that horse," she said. "I know." He'd been the one who'd taught him. It had happened gradually, over weekends and cold afternoons when the paperwork was done, and she hadn't said much about it because it hadn't needed words. And she'd learned that Cole did his most important things quietly. She looked at the upper pasture, the fence line they'd documented and defended, the boundary markers that were now in 3 sets of official records in 2 different offices. "I've been thinking about the east section," she said, "the 20 acres past the ridge. It's not being used. The terrain makes it impractical for grazing. But the soil is different there. I noticed it last fall. Darker, better water retention." Cole looked at her. "You're thinking about planting." I'm thinking about not depending entirely on cattle for the operation's income. She kept her eyes on the pasture. The railroad comes through, and it will. Regardless of Burkett, the right-of-way money won't be ours, but the traffic will be. A working operation with multiple income lines is harder to squeeze than one that has only one thing to lose. Cole was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since February. She paused. I didn't want to say anything until the ruling came through. Felt like counting things before they were certain. He looked at the ridgeline and the sky above it, the pale spring blue that always looked slightly surprised by itself after months of Wyoming gray. What would you plant? Hardy grain first. See what the soil does. If it responds the way I think it might, we could look at expanding. She turned to face him. It would require work we haven't budgeted for. I know, and it might not work. The terrain is unpredictable, and I've never farmed that specific kind of Clara. He said her name with the particular inflection that meant stop building the case against yourself. What do you need to try it? She'd already calculated this, she told him. He listened and nodded twice and said they'd go over the numbers that evening, which was how he had come to handle proposals, not with immediate yes or no, but with the commitment to look at them seriously, which she'd learned was more reliable than immediate enthusiasm. They walked back toward the house and the morning's work, and the valley was green in the way it gets in those first weeks of real spring, an almost aggressive green, as if the land is making up for lost time. The meeting in Millhaven happened on a Tuesday in late April, and Clara hadn't been planning to attend. It was a general community meeting about the proposed rail line. A representative from the development company had come to discuss the route and the right-of-way purchases, and Cole had been planning to go alone to represent the ranch's interests. But Jasper had needed her that morning for a situation with one of the pregnant cows, and by the time that was resolved, she was already dressed, and Cole was already waiting, and she simply got into the wagon. He didn't ask why she'd changed her mind. He just moved over on the seat. The meeting was in the Millhaven Civic Hall, which was a building that aspired to more than it had achieved, with good bones and a leaking roof that the town had been discussing repairing for 3 years without arriving at a plan. About 40 people were there when they walked in: ranchers, merchants, a few women who had come with husbands, and a few who had come on their own, and Harold Greer in the third row, who looked up when she came in and looked away with the specific avoidance of a man who has reconsidered a previous position and hasn't yet found the language for it. Burkett was not there. His absence was noticed. She could feel the noticing in the way people's eyes moved to the door and then moved away. The collective awareness of a space defined partly by who wasn't in it. The representative from the Railroad Development Company was a young man named Adler, who had the slightly worn look of someone who had given this presentation in many rooms to many different audiences. He laid out the route, the right-of-way boundaries, the compensation structure. Clarissa listened and made notes on a folded piece of paper she'd had in her pocket, because listening without recording was a habit she'd decided was a luxury she couldn't afford. When Adler opened the floor for questions, the room had the hesitant quality of an audience that has things to say and is waiting to see who goes first. Cole asked the first question about the timing of the right-of-way purchases and whether the compensation figures were fixed or negotiable. Adler gave the kind of answer that contained information without committing to anything, which was its own answer. Then a woman near the back asked about the northern route variant that had apparently been in earlier planning documents, but had been replaced in the current proposal. Adler handled this with careful neutrality, saying the southern route had been determined to be more practical for several technical reasons. The southern route goes through land that was recently the subject of a boundary dispute. Clara said. The room shifted. Several people turned to look at her. The dispute was resolved, she continued. The original boundary was confirmed, and the parcel in question remains part of Cole Maddox's ranch. I just want to confirm that the right-of-way calculation in the current proposal reflects the correct boundary, not the disputed one. Adler looked at her with careful attention. Can you be more specific about which section? She was. She'd brought the commission ruling's reference number. She read it aloud, which forced Adler to write it down, which meant it was now part of the official record of this meeting, which was precisely why she'd said it in a room of 40 people rather than in a private correspondence. "We'll verify against the commission's records," Adler said. "Thank you," she said. "I'd appreciate that in writing." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then the woman near the back said, "Good question," to nobody in particular, and a few people made sounds of agreement, and the meeting continued. Afterward, in the yard outside the hall, several people stopped to speak with Cole, which was normal. What was less normal was that 3 of them spoke to her directly, 2 ranchers' wives she'd seen in Millhaven before without having conversation with, and a man named Carver who ran the postal office and who had been the one to make the loaded comment about Cole's new arrangement back in November. Carver looked slightly uncomfortable, which she took as a measure of personal growth. "That was well handled," he said. "The boundary question. It needed to be asked," she said. "Yes." He paused. "I've heard, I understand. The survey situation is resolved. Formally. Yes. And Kellerman, that's between Kellerman and his account," she said pleasantly. "Just looking at the numbers." Carver nodded slowly. He had the look of a man reassessing a story he'd been telling himself. "Well, good to have things straight. Always," she said. She turned back to find Cole watching her from where he'd been talking to the ranchers, and where he'd been talking to the ranchers was the one she'd seen him see when something confirmed what he'd already believed. The quiet satisfaction of a calculation proved correct. She raised an eyebrow at him. He turned back to his conversation. She went to find the wagon. They stopped at Greer's store on the way out of town because they needed lamp oil, and Clara needed to be the one who walked in and asked for it. She understood this about herself, that there were moments she had to choose to walk toward rather than around, not for other people's benefit, but for her own, because the alternative was letting avoidance become a habit, and habits are harder to break the longer they run. Greer was behind the counter. He looked at her and did the thing she'd watched him do twice before the calculation, the brief internal weighing of how to play it. This time he came around the counter. "Mrs. Whitmore." He extended his hand. "I hear congratulations are in order. On the ranch, I mean. The survey business." She shook it. "Thank you. And I've been meaning to about last November. Lamp oil," she said. "Whatever you have in stock." He got it. He didn't charge her above the marked price, which she checked without apology. She paid and she left, and outside she put the lamp oil in the wagon and stood in the April afternoon and felt the particular settling of something that had needed to be done. Not forgiveness, exactly. She wasn't a person who arrived at that easily, and she wasn't going to manufacture it for the sake of a narrative that required it. But something. The closing of a specific circuit, maybe. Confirmation that she could walk into that room and be treated like a person who had every right to be there, and that the room's eventual cooperation was less about Harold Greer's character than about what she had made undeniable through the simple accumulation of presence and competence and time. That was the thing nobody told you about building a life in a new place. They described it as a matter of proving yourself, as if it were a single test with a clear result. But it wasn't. It was 1,000 small moments of continuing to show up in the store, at the fence line, in the civic hall, at the table with the ledger, until your presence stopped being a question and became a fact. And facts, as she'd told Kellerman, don't require defense. They just require maintenance. The east section yielded its first planted rows in May. It didn't go perfectly. 3 days into planting, they discovered a section of the soil that didn't behave the way she'd expected: clay-heavy, poorly draining, nothing like the dark, rich section she'd sampled in October. She and Cole stood at the edge of it and looked at it, and she said, "This is going to be a problem." "How much of the section?" "Maybe a quarter, maybe less." He looked at the surrounding soil. "Work around it?" "What I'm thinking." She crouched and picked up a handful of the clay soil and felt its weight. "We can't fix it this year. Maybe in a few years with enough organic matter worked in. So we plant what we can plant, and we note it for next season. Yes. He crouched beside her and looked at the soil in her hand. You're not going to say this was a mistake? It's not a mistake. It's information. She let the clay fall from her fingers. My father used to say a bad yield is just a conversation the land is having with you. You have to listen. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's actually useful. He had his moments. She stood. Come on. We have 3/4 of a good section to plant before the light's gone. Planted it. Not perfectly, there were rows that needed replanting. A miscalculation about spacing in the northern end that cost them 2 days to correct. A late cold snap in the second week of May that killed a portion of the early growth and required her to sit with the mathematics of what they'd lost and recalculate what they'd still have in September if the summer cooperated. The summer cooperated, mostly. It rained when it needed to and held off when it needed to, which was more than she'd expected from Wyoming summers, which were not known for consideration. By July, the east section had something growing in it that she could point to and defend, and that did not look like a mistake, though it also did not yet look like an obvious triumph. It looked like the early stages of something tentative, promising, requiring attention. She could work with tentative and promising. Jasper left in August. She'd known it was coming. He'd been mentioning his sister in Colorado for months, with the increasing frequency of a man who is talking himself into a decision. But when he actually came to tell Cole, she felt it the way you feel the loss of something reliable, which is different from the loss of something dramatic. Reliable things leave quieter gaps. He shook Cole's hand and then turned to her and said, "You're going to be fine here," with the directness of a man who understood that was the thing that needed to be said. "I know," she said. "Eli's going to be taller than Cole in about 10 years. I know that too." He almost smiled. He was one of those people who kept smiles in reserve, which made them worth something when they arrived. Tipped his hat and rode out, and she watched him go, and thought about all the fence posts that set together, the mornings on the North Line in the cold. Particular partnership of two people who communicate through work rather than words and find it sufficient. Gus took on more responsibility without being asked to, which she'd known he would. He was that kind of young man. Cole hired a second hand in September, a quiet woman named May who'd been working a ranch outside Crest Falls that had sold, and who had been recommended by Hardcastle with the specific endorsement of someone who doesn't recommend people unless they mean it. May looked at the east section on her first day and said, "Is this grain?" "It is," Clara said. "Hardy winter variety?" "Yes, first season." May looked at it for a moment. "Soil's good in most of it. The northwest quarter needs work." "We know." May nodded, as if this were exactly the kind of information she had been waiting for. She went to work. By the end of her first week, Clara had the specific ease around her that she associated with people who understand what they're doing and don't need to perform the understanding. It was a different ranch than the one she'd arrived at. Not unrecognizable, but different in the way that things that have been maintained and added to are different from the way they started. The books were clean and current. The fence line was documented. The water agreement was filed in 2 offices. The east section was growing. Eli knew the names of every horse and most of the cattle, and could ride well enough that she'd stopped watching him with held breath every time he went out. Cole was Cole, which was to say he was still most clearly legible in his actions rather than his words, still carried his inner life at a slight remove from its surface, still had the morning habit of going out before the household was properly awake to do what he called checking, and what was actually the private hour he needed to think. She'd learned to read the quality of those mornings from the way he came back and whether the coffee went on right away or whether he stood at the window for a while first. She knew what both meant. She knew a lot about what he meant by now. They had disagreements, real ones, not performances of difficulty about money, about priorities, about how much risk the east section represented against the more reliable cattle income, about Eli's education and what it was going to require when he got older, and the question of whether Millhaven's limited schooling was sufficient or whether she was already thinking years ahead to something larger. She held her ground in those conversations, and so did he and they, arrived at conclusions that were neither of their original positions exactly, which was, she had come to believe, the closest you could get to actual fairness in any partnership worth the name. The marriage had happened in June quietly in Crest Falls, with Hardcastle and his wife as witnesses, and Eli in the good shirt Clara had made him in May, which he'd already outgrown slightly by June, because that was what children did. It hadn't been a large event. Clara hadn't wanted a large event, and Cole had left the choice entirely to her, which was how she'd known he meant it. She'd thought about Owen, briefly and without the old anger. Thought about how different a thing could look when it was built on different materials. Owen had been charming where Cole was plain. Owen had been confident where Cole was careful. Owen had made her feel seen in moments and invisible in the spaces between them, which was its own particular kind of loneliness. Cole made her feel seen consistently, without fanfare, the way a person feels seen, when another person simply pays attention over a long enough period that the attention becomes a fact about the relationship. She didn't compare them often. It wasn't useful. But sometimes, in the way of a person who has recovered from something difficult, she let herself understand the distance between where she'd been and where she was, not for the satisfaction of the contrast, but to keep an honest account of what things cost and what they're worth. In September, when the first grain harvest came in modest, promising, enough to confirm that the east section was going to be worth the investment in subsequent years, Clara sat on the porch steps in the early evening and watched Eli and Cole come in from the field together. Eli, talking with the full-body commitment conversation brought to all conversations, Cole listening with a particular attention given to Eli's questions since the wagon ride to Crest Falls when he'd answered every one of them. She thought about what she would have told herself in November of the previous year, standing in Harold Greer's store with $3.40 and a 4-year-old holding her coat. She would have said, "Get through the night." That had been the entire horizon. Not build something, not fight for something, just get through the night. And she had. And then she'd gotten through the morning, and the week, and the winter, and all the things that winter had contained: Burkett, Pruitt, Kellerman, storm, the cattle, the shoulder, the letters, the meetings, the fence line documentation written in her father's kind of language, the careful and imperfect building of something real in a place that had not initially wanted to have her. Oh, the thing she understood now that she hadn't fully understood in that store was that surviving the night was never just about the night. Every act of surviving is also an act of building, even when you can't see what you're building yet. Every fence post you set in frozen ground is part of a line that will hold something. Every ledger entry written correctly is part of a record that will matter later. Every conversation you have with honesty and precision is part of a foundation that other conversations will eventually stand on. She hadn't known that in November. She'd thought she was just trying not to disappear. Turned out that not disappearing was enough to start with. Cole sat down beside her on the step. He smelled like the field and the September evening and the specific mixture that she'd stopped analyzing and simply associated with the end of a day that had been what it needed to be. Eli had gone inside, trailing some project behind him, already explaining to nobody in particular the next thing he intended to build. "Good yield," Cole said. "Better than I expected for a first season. The northwest quarter's going to need addressing before next planting." "I know. I've been thinking about it." She paused. "There's a technique for breaking up clay soil with specific cover crops. Takes a full season, but it changes the composition permanently. You've been reading." "I've always been reading." She looked at the field, the pale gold of the September grass in the late light. "It'll cost us a season's potential yield on that section. Worth it long term, yes." He sat beside her in the evening, and she sat beside him. And it wasn't the piece of people who had solved everything. There was still the question of Eli's education, and the Northwest quarter, and next year's cattle prices, and May's increasing hints that she'd like a more formal arrangement with the ranch, which they'd need to discuss, and the fence on the south side that had been concerning Jasper before he left and that she hadn't gotten to yet. There was all of that. But in this particular moment, there was just the field and the evening and the two of them on the step, which was a thing that had not been possible a year ago and was now in simply what the end of a day looked like. And she understood it as what it was not the end of difficulty, but the establishment of something solid enough to face difficulty from. Place to stand, Eli came back to the door. "Mama," he said, "what's for dinner?" "What do you think is for dinner?" she said. "Stew," he said, with the resignation of a child who has made peace with a recurring reality. And he considered, "Cornbread? If you get the fire built up." He disappeared inside again, feet loud on the floor, in the way of children who are in a hurry, but have no specific urgency. They heard the sound of him working at the stove, the small domestic racket of a 5-year-old doing a job he'd been given, and intending to do it right. Cole said, "He's going to need school next year. Real school." "I know. Millhaven's not going to be enough." "I know that too." She'd been thinking about this since winter. There was a school in Crest Falls that was larger, better resourced, run by a woman named Ines Portman, who had a reputation for thoroughness. The logistics were not simple. "We'll figure it out." "Yes," he said, "we will." It was the we she'd needed once. She didn't need it the same way anymore. She was past the stage of needing reassurance that the word applied to her. Still noticed it, still registered the specific warmth of a pronoun that contained two people who had chosen to face things together, and she thought that noticing it was probably the right response. Gratitude without dependence, appreciation without confusion about what the appreciation was for. What it was for was this: a man who had said, "We'll try it," when he hadn't known her, who had lit a stove in a barn, who had answered every question a 4-year-old asked on a long wagon road, who had accepted help without diminishment and given it without performance, and who had understood, somewhere in the long Wyoming winter, that the woman he'd let through his gate was not a person who'd come to receive anything, but a person who'd come to build. And that building alongside someone was an entirely different thing from building alone. The light was going off the field now. The September dusk coming in from the east the way it always did, pulling color out of things and leaving the shapes behind. The valley was quiet in the specific way of places where the day's work is finished and the night's cold hasn't yet arrived. A held breath moment that didn't last but was worth sitting in. Clara thought about the morning she'd walked down the slope toward this ranch, the gate that had been closed and that she'd opened anyway. The decision she'd made in the frozen road when she'd thought about Harold Greer's face, turned back to his ledger, and decided that she was not going to let that be the last word on what she was worth. She'd been right. That was still a little strange to sit with, not the fact of being right, but the distance between the woman who'd made that choice in the cold and the woman sitting on this step in September. They were the same frozen person. That was the part that mattered. She hadn't become someone else. She'd become more clearly herself, which is the only kind of becoming worth the cost. There is something that the frontier taught, or that hard things in general teach, that is difficult to explain to someone who hasn't learned it from the ground up. It isn't resilience, exactly, though people call it that. It isn't strength, though that word gets used. It's something more like continuity. The understanding that you are the same person on the other side of difficult things as you were on this side, and that what you do in the middle matters, and that doing it with honesty and precision, and without abandoning your own accounting of what is true, that is not something that can be taken from you, because it isn't a thing you're given. It's a thing you make, day by day, fence post by fence post, ledger entry by ledger entry, conversation by conversation. Clara Whitmore had walked into a Wyoming valley with nothing but herself and her sons and the skills her father had given her, and the stubbornness that had always been hers, and she had made something. Not perfect, not finished, but hers, genuinely and defensibly hers, built in the kind of honest language that doesn't require interpretation later. That was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. Inside, the stove fire crackled up properly, and Eli announced, with satisfaction, that it was going well, which it was. The evening settled around the ranch like something that belonged there, and Clara Whitmore, Clara Maddox, now, though she carried both names in different ways, for different purposes, because that too was honest, sat on the step with her husband and watched the last light leave the field, and did not look back at the door that had closed, and did not need to. There was work tomorrow. There was always work tomorrow. That had once been the thing that made the weight of a day feel heavier. Now it was the reason to be glad the day was still going.